Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Reflecting the Way Radio. I'm your host, Evan, and just right off the bat here, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping and we will jump right in. First off, make sure you head over to the website if you haven't already done so and sign up for the email list. That sign up form is in the footer of every page and along the right-hand side of most pages, excluding the front page. We won't flood your inbox, but we would appreciate it if you could sign up for that. It would really help us out. Also, don't forget to check us out on our social sites, Twitter and Facebook. We're at Reflect the Way on Twitter and Reflecting the Way on Facebook. They're both linked from the website as well. You can go that way. You'll also find them in the description box below this episode if you're listening on Blog Talk. Okay, so that's out of the way. This is a bit of a bonus episode. I don't actually have a specific article written for this episode like I have for the previous 4. It's kind of an extension of the last 2 episodes of Reflecting the Way Radio, and it ties directly back to the money question. If you missed the previous 2 episodes, I'd recommend you go back and listen to those. If you're listening to the archive on the site, just scroll down. If you're listening on Blog Talk, it's under our episodes list. In those 2 episodes, they were called Money and the Root of Evil. We looked at how money was created, how it is basically a modern slavery system designed to entrap the common man. And we also looked at the esoteric, occultic uses for money and the money system, how it's an occult energy grid, and the fact that it is the ultimate incarnation of 3,000 years of alchemy. And I'm not going to rehash it, but if you haven't listened to it and you haven't read those articles, I would highly recommend you go back and do that. The articles are linked in the description box below. It'll be well worth your time. You won't need to have listened to or read those articles before listening to this episode tonight. It is tied in, but it's not a direct extension. Like I said, this is a bit of a bonus. Now, this is going to be highly unscripted, though if you are one to follow along in your Bible, I would recommend at this point you open your Bible to Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. We'll go through verse 33, and I'll read it in a minute here. While you're turning there, I'll just say this. This is the story of Jesus meeting the disciples on the water, walking on the water in the midst of a storm, after he had spent the day praying on a mountain, and he walked out to the boat on the water to meet the disciples after a storm had kicked up, and they thought he was a spirit. Now, the common understanding of this story that we've all heard in Sunday school is you just have to trust God, and frankly, that's about as deep a teaching as I've ever heard on that parable or that story. It's not a parable, it was a historical event, but regardless, that's about the deepest teaching I've ever heard on that passage, and that's highly unfortunate because that story is a multi-layered tapestry of meaning, and we're going to dig into one of those meanings here on this episode. Interestingly enough, this kind of came by divine revelation, if you will. I was doing some homework, not on the money system per se. I was watching a documentary on the legal system in North America, the common law legal system, and I studied this a little bit in post-secondary, though I didn't study what goes on behind the curtain. And I was watching a documentary on what goes on behind the curtain, specifically to do with maritime admiralty law, how we are sold a bill of goods that we're innocent until proven guilty, and we have habeas corpus and all that. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of legal jargon here, but basically, under the common law system, you're told that you have a certain set of rights and you're innocent until proven guilty, though in practice, since the beginning of the Cold War, effectively most Western nations are in fact under a form of martial law called maritime admiralty law. And this is not what this episode is about, but just to give you a little background of how this came to me here, I was watching a documentary on that. And not a documentary done by Christian people by any stretch, quite the opposite, in fact. But they started talking about this maritime admiralty law, and something inside me just kind of clicked. and I had this revelation. So if you found Matthew 14 starting in verse 22, I'm going to read it here, and then we'll get into the meaning behind it. So starting in verse 22, Matthew 14 says, "And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side," speaking of the Sea of Galilee, "while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent the multitude away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary." We were in a storm. "And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus said unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth, thou art the Son of God. Okay, now I'm going to mention here that it's important when we start talking about the hidden meaning in Scripture that we don't throw out the surface meaning. That's not what I'm looking to do here. That's a common trick you'll see certain folks of a not-so-Christian persuasion do, is they'll say, I have the highest respect for the Bible, and then they'll go off and they'll talk about, I hesitate to even use the word, but it's accurate. They throw out the exoteric meaning, meaning they chuck out the surface meaning, and they only keep the esoteric meanings and only the ones that fit them. Now, most people associate the word esoteric specifically with the occult. Most of the time it is, but the word just means hidden or veiled, not in the sense of occult necessarily, just to say that it's a meaning deeper than the surface meaning. You have exoteric meanings and you have esoteric meanings. This is true not just in religion, not just in philosophy, but there's even in certain sciences you have exoteric and esoteric meanings. So don't kill me, don't stone me for using the word, but there is an exoteric meaning here, there's a surface meaning, and there's a deeper level meaning. Now, I'm sure we've all heard this story, and I'm sure you've all heard teachings on this story about how you have to trust in God when the waves are high and yada yada. Okay, that's fine, that's true, but it doesn't strike very deep. It's just kind of taking the surface story and re-quoting it back at you. Now, here's the thing. This is obviously an extension on my money series. So what on earth does this story have to do with money? Okay, good question. Now remember I said this is a divine revelation. Some of you may not understand what I'm saying. And that's okay. I would implore you to seek the Father for ears to hear and eyes to see. For those of you that are going to understand what I'm going to say, that's great. Let's move on. I'm not going to over-explain this because if you don't get it, unfortunately, I don't mean to sound arrogant or like a jerk, but if you don't get it, you don't get it. Some of this you just can't explain. It has to just be kind of picked up divinely through osmosis, if you like. So that out of the way, let's understand that we're moving from looking at the surface meaning to a deeper meaning here, okay? The Bible is, or I shouldn't say it is, in certain areas it can be highly symbolic. Jesus himself said that he taught in parables because the people he was speaking to couldn't handle what he was teaching. So he spoke in parables so that those with eyes to see and ears to hear could understand, and those that didn't have that wouldn't understand, and they wouldn't, fly off the deep end. So the symbolism here is interesting. And like I said, this came when I was looking at a law documentary, but it's about economics. So it wasn't even directly related. But what you have here is you have the disciples in a boat. Now, first thing to note is a boat is a vessel made by human hands, okay? They have a boat and they're on water. Now, a boat on water, that's not anything spectacular in and of itself, but remember, the boat is a construct of man. Water is representative of money. Now, why do I say that? Well, just even look at the vernacular associated with money. When you talk to an accountant, he may talk about your liquidity, right? Liquidity like water, right? How easy it is for you to turn your assets into cash or, that sort of thing. When you talk about business, you talk about cash flow, just like water flows, right? In economics, you have ebbs and flows in markets. You have waves up and down, right? Water and money, frankly, I don't want to get into occult teaching, but in the occult, water is associated with money. But it's more than just occult because it actually saturates the actual language itself, cash flow and stuff like that. So water here is representative of money or the economics as a whole. Now, if I'm losing you, just stay with me here. Hear me out to the end. You have Jesus who comes walking on the water to the boat in the midst of a storm. Okay? Now, Jesus is outside the human construct that is the boat. In this situation, that boat is representative of the money system of man. Okay, this contrived, frankly, evil system that has been set up to enslave you and siphon off your energy. That refers back to our last episode. The boat is representative of basically the fractional reserve banking system because that is a man-made creation, the boat is a man-made creation, and everybody on the boat thinks they have to be in the boat in order to survive, just like everybody you meet on the street thinks they have to be bought into the interest-driven fractional reserve system in order to survive. And to an extent, that's true in everyday life. But Jesus comes walking on the water. Now, this ties back to the end of last episode where we talked about having to extricate yourself from the control grid. And this is a picture of that, believe it or not. Jesus comes walking on the water, and Peter says, if it's you, Lord, tell me to step out of the boat, and I'll step out of the boat. So Jesus says, yeah, Peter, come on down. Peter steps out of the boat, and he walks on water, as long as he keeps his eyes fixed on Christ. Now, as soon as he starts looking at the wind and waves, he starts to sink, right? Here's the thing. This is scary on every level. What the picture is here is Jesus standing outside of the accepted normal money system that we live in, the boat, basically. He's standing outside the boat that is the fractional reserve banking system, and he's saying, come out here. And you have to look at the wind and waves and say, I have to walk out there with no boat. I'm going to sink, right? Sink it's also another term that can be associated with bankruptcy, right? You hear about people keeping their head above water, staying ahead of their debt, right? So Peter gets out of the boat and he walks to Jesus, or starts to anyway. Now here's another little interesting ditty. Peter, the name in English, is Peter. The name itself means rock or stone. Stones and rocks don't typically tend to float very well. Now, as long as Peter kept his eyes fixed on Christ, he could walk through the waves representing the ups and downs of the financial markets, right? But when he looked at the wind, it actually says specifically the wind. By extension, we could assume the waves. But it says when he saw the wind. Now, that's interesting in and of itself because you don't actually physically see wind, right? You can see what the wind moves. You can see the waves. You can see the rain. But it says when Peter looked at the wind. So what does the wind represent here? Well, if the boat is our fractional reserve banking system, the waves represent our economic ups and downs, right? And clearly they're in a storm, so this would be representative of a not so good financial time, maybe like the one we're in now. The wind is itself unseen, but the effects of the wind are seen and felt. They are the forces behind the market that cause the market ups and downs, okay? Now, stay with me here again. Peter looks at the wind, and he stops looking at Jesus, and he starts to sink, okay? These forces that drive the market, these are the unseen hands, if you like. You know, the giant black octopus that hides behind central banks and manipulates all things economic. It's a picture. You can see the effects that octopus has on the markets and on business and on jobs and on how your neighbor got laid off. You can't actually see the forces at work, though. They're hidden. They're occult in every sense of the word. Occult means hidden. Just like in the story of Jesus and Peter here, it says he looks at the wind. Well, he's not actually seeing the air. He's seeing the effects of the wind. When he starts to worry about the effects of the wind, he starts to sink. He starts to sink beneath the waves of the market. His head is going to slip below water. He's going to sink. He's going to go, in modern vernacular, this would be bankrupt, right? He has to call to Jesus and say, Lord, help, and Jesus picks him up, okay? The meaning here is twofold. Number one, if you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, you can extricate yourself from the worldly money system of man. You can extricate yourself from that, and you can walk over the peaks and valleys of a market outside of the fractional reserve banking system. If you take your eyes off and you start worrying about the forces behind the curtain, you're going to sink like a Peter, like a Petros, like a stone under the waves. Your head is going to fall below water. You're going to sink. You're going to go bankrupt. You must keep your eyes fixed on Christ and Christ first and Christ only. When you start to sink, your only salvation is going to be Lord help, okay? But the story doesn't end there. It actually gets more interesting because Jesus picks Peter up and then they walk to the boat. And actually, this is one I've not quite figured out. Jesus asks Peter, wherefore did your faith falter? And you never read Peter's answer. Now, I find that interesting, but I'm not sure why that is. But Jesus picks Peter up and they walk to the boat. Presumably they climb aboard. And then something happens. It's implied there that the wind and waves stop and the sea becomes peaceful, right? So what you now have here is a picture of a believer stepping out in faith who would otherwise sink like a stone to the bottom of the economic totem pole and drown, steps out in faith with his eyes fixed on Christ, walks out over the market outside of the fractional reserve banking system, comes back to the fractional reserve banking system, to the people that were around him before he left. Call this in modern vernacular friends, family members, and acquaintances, right? Comes back to them with Jesus, and suddenly the wind and waves are gone. Interesting, right? We are called to not be part of this money system. I think I hashed that out pretty good in the previous episode, so I won't go through that and justify that statement here. But we're called out of that system, though we're also called, if you look at this story in this context, to come back and bring peace to those that are still in it. And I think by extension, it's a small leap to say that we are also called to bring those people out of it. Look what I've done through Christ by leaving this system, by leaving this construct of man, this boat, this money system. I've left this manly money system, this money system of man, which is a human construct, and I am surviving in Christ alone outside of this fallen money matrix. And I can walk over the peaks and valleys of the economy unfazed as long as my eyes are fixed on Christ. What does that look like on an individual basis? Frankly, I can't tell you that. That's between you and Jesus. However, I can tell you that sitting at home in the evening, getting ready to work your 9 to 5 or your 8 to 5, 40 hours a week, remember that's an encoded curse all on its own, your 8 to 5, 40-hour a week job, paying your mortgage for 25 years, constantly being dependent on somebody else to sign your paycheck so that you can eat and feed your family and pay your debt, which you shouldn't have, is not the God-sanctioned model for living your life. You see all through the scriptures, be indebted to no man. Why? It's not so you can be arrogant. It's so that somebody else is not your master, because the debtor is always servant to the lender. And if you have borrowed money, if you've borrowed money, you are now a servant to the bank, which was set up by some of the most evil men in existence ever. So now you're a servant to the dark side, like it or not. If you have debt, you're a servant to the dark side. If you're working for somebody else, you're relying on them to feed your family. Now, I understand not everybody can be self-employed, and that maybe isn't always God's plan for everybody to be self-employed, though I'd say in a lot of cases it is. Like I said, I can't give you specifics. All I can tell you is that you need to get out of the boat. Now, am I doing this perfectly? Probably not. But I tell you one thing, I'm doing my best to get out of the boat. I'm as out of the boat as I think I can be right now, and I'm trying to get further out of the boat, and I'm trying to do it as quickly as I can. And I don't ever plan on getting back in the boat once I'm out of the boat. I want to stand on the water by myself with Jesus without having to use a construct of man to float myself through life, because that's not what we're called to. Unfortunately, there is no easy name it and claim it, blab it and grab it here. You have to go to the Father yourself and ask him what this means for you, what you need to do, and I'll tell you right now, it will not be comfortable. You're going to probably have to give up some things. You're probably going to have to tighten the old belt a couple notches and hike up your boots and hold your nose and do it for a couple of, well, who knows how long. But the fact of the matter is, in the long run, you'll be blessed for it and you will be much better off. The other thing is here, if you're a parent or plan to be a parent, I can't speak unequivocally, I'm not a parent, but something to consider is if you have children, you may want to find a way that both keeps your children learning responsibility, but at the same time, you find a way for them to get out on their own in a way that allows them to do it without taking debt. Okay? The story was about a husband and a wife, though I think it applies here to kids as well. In this context, the story goes that a pastor asks a man, "What do you think your wife is worth in dollars?" And the man says, "Excuse me? What did you just ask me?" He's getting a little worked up, the insinuation there. And the pastor says, "Well, what would you sell your wife for?" And the man's getting a little defensive, and he says, "I wouldn't sell my wife for any price. What are you saying? She's not a harlot, right?" And the pastor says, "Well, if that's true, then why do you sell her to her boss every day for $15 an hour?" Whoops. Okay. So that kind of applies to your kids as well, right? Why are you going to have children and then set them up to take a mortgage? Now, if your kids have a mortgage and you co-signed for it or you endorsed it, I'm not passing any kind of judgment. This information is probably new to you. But now that you do know it, it might do you well to prayerfully consider what I'm saying here and try and build a way for your children to move from dependent on you to independent of you, but do it in a way that has them avoid debt. Now, I'm not just talking mortgage, I'm talking school debt and everything else. I have my own opinions on post-secondary education, but we won't go there for now. But I'm sure, I can say this with 99% surety, that if you build a way for your children to move out on their own and become independent in such a way that it allows them to do it without taking debt, and possibly to do it in a way that they are self-employed from day one till the day they decide to retire, I have little doubt in my mind that on Judgment Day you will be rewarded for your efforts. We are told, I believe it's in Timothy, that those who do not take care of their family are worse than an infidel. Now, in modern society, we wouldn't consider the fact that having your kid take a mortgage is not taking care of them. But I would suggest that, at least on some level, turning your children over to the bank so that they can be servants of the dark side and have them sign on to a mortgage or a student loan or any other form of debt is, in fact, turning your back on your family. Now, like I said, don't get all defensive about me saying that. If you're in a position where your children took debt, that's fine. I'm sure at the time you, not to be offensive, this is not meant in an offensive way, just in the truest sense of the word, at the time you were probably ignorant, and I'm sure they don't resent you for it. So what's done is done. What's in the past is in the past. But if you're coming up to having kids or you have young children, consider this. So I hope I didn't lose anybody there, but that's what I had for you this episode, and I hope somebody out there understood what I'm saying, and take it to the Father, and you tell me if I'm out to lunch. I don't think I am, but this is just one example of how deep some of the stories, especially in the New Testament, can go if you start picking away at layers and digging for the hidden meanings of them. Jesus said that his parables had many layers in them, and I'm constantly surprised at how many people don't dig for them. So I will leave you with that this evening, and I do hope and pray that this will positively impact you somehow and encourage you to step out of the boat and get your feet onto those waves. So I will leave you with that tonight, and blessings.